The third twin. Please leave the skepticism and listen to the story with the gravity it deserves. The fate of the whole world and humanity could depend on it. These are not just the ramblings of an old woman who never had a good grasp of reality and is now teetering on the brink of insanity. This is an appeal, nay, a warning of a new emerging eldritch cult that wants to hijack humanity's entire identity. Listen to this hastily rambled story that I'm trying to send out into the world before they can get to me. Because through my eye, that thing can see what I see. And please, retain faith that what you hear is real until the end. After that, I leave the choice to you, whether you want to forget this entire story or try to do something about it. There is no logical starting place for this story, as I have actually been carrying it since birth. I am one half of a twin. When we were young, we were a pair of two cute little girls who couldn't be told apart. A fact we didn't help by dressing exactly the same all the time. Now, we couldn't be further apart. Me in a now aged and worn-out body, with only the uterus in still insidiously good condition. She still beautiful and young, because of the black magic she uses to be a good hostess. My life is allowed only by my undeniable connection to that thing, and because no one can predict what effect my death might have upon it. We are, after all, a new phenomenon, unseen in the entire lore of eldritch knowledge. As little girls, we had lovely blonde locks and incredibly dark brown eyes. We wore simple clothes as we came from a simple farming family who lived somewhere on the outskirts in the Eldam area between the Belgian and Dutch Limburgs. Perhaps it's because we were so far away from the more crowded, decent society, in areas where nature is least disturbed, that thing was able to find its access to us. In any case, we were never considered completely normal throughout our entire early academic trajectory. In kindergarten, primary, and secondary schools, we were always labeled as strange and distracted. I much more so than my sister, who could have passed as normal had she not been part of a scary twin. The effect was further amplified because puberty hit us particularly early. I considered this part of the dark effect that the thing had upon us. Although it made the children avoid us even more out of some kind of indescribable latent fear. The doctors considered it statistically unlikely, but not excessively abnormal. And in high school, our other classmates began to catch up with us in terms of height, making us seem only a little older than we were. We might have been considered normal by people who didn't know us. However, the kids who did know us kept avoiding us, presumably more out of habit than anything else. This is probably also why I never really had a boyfriend or girlfriend, since I can't imagine a healthy sexual interaction while that thing is watching. As for my sister, I don't know what the problem was in this area. Had she not been constantly clinging to me at the time, for we loved each other dearly, despite our lack of individuality, she would have certainly been able to find a sweetheart, or at least something casual later in life. But she never seemed interested in it. Maybe she was always just asexual. I've mentioned it a few times, and now I can put it off no longer. The big problem I have is that for as long as I can remember, probably since our birth, I can always see a thing out of the corner of my eye. It is an evil entity floating through my field of vision. It is clearly not part of the material world, because when I turn around quickly, it floats on the other side as if it had always been there. But it couldn't have been completely immaterial either, because it kept filling only part of the open space, never going through any object. It also interacted with light strangely. I could see the thing and what was behind it perfectly simultaneously. From this, one might draw the conclusion that light simply passes through it, but it does form shadows in my field of vision, and depending on how dark it is, it reflects more or less light. So the light must have at least been reflected in part. It is a physical paradox that I've never been able to resolve, and from which my only reasonable conclusion was that everything must be taking place in my mind, like some kind of malignant tumor of my soul. I repeat again for clarity that except when I was unconscious, I have seen this thing every moment of my life. This is how I have always known the world, and I only realized later in life, from the distressed reactions of adults, and even my own sister, to certain of my childhood drawings or questions, how abnormal this really was. As a child, I could still dismiss it as some kind of horrible imaginary friend. But I always knew it was more than that. I often doubted my own mental health then, and learned to just keep quiet about it. My sister could not know exactly what I was going through, but she did show partial understanding because she herself suffered from auditory hallucinations, which I knew she herself was learning to hide. This has always made me wonder how many disturbed people are an ordinary part of society because they can sufficiently hide their own insanity. I realize that by now your curiosity can't be tamed. You want to know what the thing looks like, and to add credibility to my story, I'm afraid there is no escaping a sufficient description. I take no pleasure from this, and by the end of this explanation, you will probably wish you hadn't imagined it, or you will conclude that this is all just a sick concoction of an insane old wench. Again, I would ask that you postpone your disbelief until after I finish my story. The thing, monster is perhaps the better word, has no real fixed form. It is not like us, fixed in a body that only changes with age, but does not go through any fundamental restructuring. Perhaps the best description I can give is that it is a cloud of flesh. Not so much red in color, like intestines of humans and animals alike, but rather a sickly shade of green. Her shape changes according to her whims, like the convulsions of muscles stretching beyond what should be possible. Protruding eyes form at will all over her body, or sometimes the whole sphere will form a single large eye socket. If it were a living organism, it would have not yet evolved skin. Constantly, pus seeps down, the droplets of which reform in the middle of their fall into snakes made of veins that wind their way back up. In the dark, or when there is not enough light to discern shades of color, it becomes more like a kind of childlike scribbling, where the ink colors outside the lines of its form. The only constant in the form are the strange, hideous tentacles that wind around her body like muscles, and which, were she material, would help her manipulate the world. When she was bored during certain of my classes, such as mainly biology, parts of her body would grotesquely take the shape of certain diagrams of organs or genitals that I was shown. For me, this became all too common. This is the reason that unlike the fear or reluctance of the other children, and even my sister, I was much more likely to autopsy the frogs or watch the videos of slaughtered rabbits and birthing mothers with a typical boredom that comes from prolonged exposure. The only things that did seem to affect me were the sounds and smells involved, and these, strangely enough, did not seem to affect my sister. Back then there was no communication whatsoever between that thing and myself. My body was as alien to her as her body was to mine. And with only sight, there was no basis or patience to develop some kind of new cross-species sign language. Even emotions, if that thing has any, were not derivable, for though it sometimes made melting impressions of certain faces my eyes saw, it had no clear face of its own. After a certain point, however, a strange stream of communication did manage to emerge, but it was not without my sister's doing. As you have probably gathered by now, I am not the only abnormal girl of our twin. This is a fact that only revealed itself to me through a particular series of events, which, for other people, would have been traumatic. One night, when we were actually still too young, but could pretend to be old enough, we snuck away from our parents' home. That night we would go dancing in the clubs of Eldam, since the town may have been remote, but was not completely deserted. We got in without a hitch, and once there we feasted on the drinks desperate drunken men bought for us. They presumably thought they might get lucky with a naive young girl, or two. To be frank, we weren't even that beautiful. Our dresses were more suited for a church, and in our frugal family, we certainly hadn't learned how to put on makeup.
Makeup is for hookers,
our father used to say. But nevertheless, we were never short on booze. As twins, apparently, inordinately stimulate the imagination of men. Whether it was purely from the drink, or from something extra someone had added, I do not know. But in any case, my stomach was upset, and since the women's toilets were overcrowded, we went outside. My sister supported me as we stumbled down some alleyway, where I could relieve my stomach, while she held my hair and rubbed my back. As you might expect in an area so rural, we were followed by some indecent country bumpkins that must have seen us leave the party, and they interrupted us while I was trying to empty my stomach. As the three of them approached us, they looked like they must have been 2 meters tall from our perspective. My sister fell backwards in silent fear on the step of a closed doorway. I, on the other hand, possibly too drunk or drugged to realize my situation, laughed it off. These men were not half as scary as the thing I could see literally every waking moment of my life. And this clearly got on their nerves. And in an obviously forced deep voice, one of them said,
"You shouldn't have done that. We thought we'd approach this sensually. Give you your pleasure too. But maybe we'd better show you who the men are."
Only now did my heart start pounding as I began to realize the gravity of the situation. However, it was now my sister's turn to burst into laughter. Such a fake deep voice. Come on, that's not scary at all. Showing us who the men are? Rather show us that your balls have yet to drop. The thing in my field of vision was still there, and a mouth with crooked yellowed fangs formed on one of its tentacles. It seemed to utter a silent scream. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, my sister spoke. Yes, exactly. Now that is scary. You can see her? I hissed out. See? No, surely you mean here, was her reply. We then wanted to start a whole new conversation. But we had not yet escaped our predicament, and the hillbillies thought we were tripping and that our game would be all the easier for it. I was completely done with the situation, and I really didn't feel like it anymore. So I cried out a bellow, quickly rang the door we were up against, and puked out the contents of my stomach, which had long been ready for release, all over myself and my sister. Even twins are not so hot that a man would be willing to overcome puke, and the hillbillies fled into the wind. Honestly, did they really think we were just going to let them do it? These kind of men just rely on you being too scared to do anything about your situation. Our dresses were ruined, and this outing was now impossible to hide from our parents. But still, it was better than being raped. Besides that, we didn't care. For the first time in all our lives, we both knew we were not crazy. In the months that followed, we tried everything we could to somehow communicate with that thing. But that was easier said than done. In me, it seemed to show no interest at all, except to visually assist in the communication with my sister. Well, that is not entirely correct. At first it had an interest in me too. But she must have come from a completely unearthly race, for she tried to communicate with some kind of eternally spinning spirals of different colors. When that went nowhere, she focused her attention on my sister, where she seemed to be more successful. Although real communication was not possible with me, I was at least able to assist them in interpreting the sounds the thing or my sister made. We learned that our attempts at communication were smoother when my sister was in my field of vision. This led us to hypothesize that the thing could somehow see through my eye. And conversely, it also led us to suspect that she was probably able to hear through my sister's ears in a similar fashion. I once asked my sister what the thing sounded like, and she indicated that it was a difficult question. She explained that sound is only the closest sense she can use to describe it, but that it goes deeper than that, as if vibrations run across her soul itself and resonate like deep waves within her. There also weren't any clear words, but rather strange echoes of thoughts, a bit like she can see the fingerprints left by a word. She also did indicate that since our discovery, the thing resonates continuously in her head, like a kind of constant massage of her soul, although it seemed less focused when we were not specifically trying to communicate with it. At last, she also mentioned that she sounds a lot softer and less scary now than before our discovery, as if it was a discovery for the thing as well that we were able to notice it. In those months, we may have gone a little bit overboard when it comes to experimentation, but admit it, you would also want to get to the bottom of this, if you were dealing with such a thing yourself. We tried all sorts of alternative methods, such as Ouija boards, tarot cards, and even speaking to mediums. The thing itself tried to aid us in these endeavors, which I noticed because it would try to put its tentacles on the tarot cards, the board, or the mediums. Or it would excrete its pus over them and try to hold it into place for as long as possible, before it inevitably snaked back to its larger mass. The mediums were almost all crooks, but there was one such person, from a traveling circus, who did manage to give us a hint. I'm still not sure if that one really felt something, or just acted really well and happened to hit a nail on the head. This man pretended to be a gypsy, and had a ring beard, a turban, a glass ball and all. He just seemed too young, too white, or just too Belgian to really fit the role. In any case, his so-called speciality was viewing and recalling past lives of the soul. You could pay him, and he would do a whole performance to show you all the things you had done in your past life, and what lessons you still carry from that, or what you need to do now to reassure your past lives and become truly happy. With us, he looked a bit perplexed when we said we wanted to do this together, because we are twins and therefore must share a soul. Our main reason for this request was that if this was real, he was more likely to notice the thing if he studied us at the same time. The thing then did something I hadn't seen it do before. One of the writhing tentacles that formed its muscles slithered out of the sphere and into the man's ear. It may have just been my imagination, but I could have sworn that the charlatans shivered for just a moment. However, this shiver might also have been explained by the intense gaze with which I kept looking just beside him. What was less easily explained was the brief flash I had a moment later. It felt more like an intrusive thought, of which you can't explain the origin. It's a bit like when you see a train coming and suddenly think, I could just jump on the tracks in front of it and end it all here. Even though you're not suicidal and you don't act upon that thought. Or it might be more like when you suddenly see before you the gruesome death of a mean teacher, or your boss, or whoever is making your life miserable at the time. It gives you a moment of relief while you ignore their angry preachings. But you'll catch yourself imagining this more and more often, even with people who don't make your life miserable at all, with friends and family. Well, that's what it felt like, as if it had not necessarily been a supernatural flash, but perhaps just my too active and rather morbid imagination that was acting up. Although this was not an image I normally imagined. I saw the man writhing his body in awfully flexible curves, tentacles all over his body, and his eyes twisted into the back of his sockets, so you could see only the blooded whites. Blood poured from all the openings in his head, mouth, nose, eyes, and ears. But it was not red human blood. Rather, it was the strange pus that the thing always drips everywhere. Unlike his outward contortion, that seemed extremely painful, he was laughing hysterically, as if feeling the deepest of pleasures. As I said, it was only a brief flash of less than a second. But I had immediate confirmation that I had really seen the flash, for my sister muttered questioningly under her breath, "Laughter?" as if she heard what I saw. This confirmation was both welcome and disturbing. Apparently, we must have seen a fraction of that thing's imagination. and it was not wholesome. As a matter of fact, my sister had been doing this kind of mumbling more often ever since we realized that the thing really existed. She told me that it didn't seem like a bad idea to vocalize her thoughts very quietly under her breath, so that the thing could hear what she was thinking. That way, it might get a little more insight into human thought, which might make future communication easier. Like a professional, the man naturally picked up on this muttering immediately and indicated that there was indeed laughter in our past lives. We clearly had to have been a beautiful princess living a good life. To be honest, we immediately realized this was all bullshit. But what followed seemed to be less bullshit. Part of the thing's body seemed to merge into a light smoke or mist that mixed with the candlelight of the tent. The man seemed to inhale her before he spoke. His voice seemed to have dropped a tone as he described that we did not in fact share a soul, despite being twins. The frown did not disappear from his face, as if he saw something he did not fully understand. He continued that it was in fact the exact opposite, that we are more than two. Our hearts started pounding in excitement, but then the moment was gone. The whole aura of the place returned to normal. The man crossed his arms and shuddered for a moment, and then explained that he didn't understand why, but that he had a faint impression that the both of us combined somehow had 3 different souls. Then, after a few moments, understanding fell across his face. He said that it took a while for him to realize it, but that he did not appreciate our ruse. Supernatural talents such as soul insight should not be put to the test. He said that he had now also done a reading for our 3rd sister, and so we had to pay for 3 people. It took us a while to understand what he meant, but apparently he thought we wanted to test him by saying we were twins while we were actually triplets. That made our 3rd sister wait outside. When he would have then described our souls as twins, we would have known that he was a quack. He was quite proud of this deduction, and in the end, we did end up paying him for 3. Because, admittedly, one could argue that the thing was perhaps a 3rd soul, and in that light, this was all rather spectacular. At the time, we actually suspected that this was just a theatrical performance to scam us out of more money. It was only later that day, when we got home, that we would lose this suspicion. Our parents did not understand our esoteric and occult interests at all, but did try their best to take an interest themselves in what fascinated us. At the time, we had a surprisingly open communication with our parents. Although we never tried to explain the thing, we knew that they would send us back to the specialists that helped us in our childhood, for the twisted drawings where I still depicted that thing, and for my sister's auditory hallucinations. So when they asked us about our day, we naturally told them about a soul reader who thought we were triplets. Instead of the laughter we expected for getting scammed so easily, our mother started crying and ran to the bedroom upstairs. Our father, on the other hand, held strong and stayed at the dining table, looking away and trying not to make eye contact. He remained silent for a while, until he finally admitted that the fortune teller was right. We should have indeed been born triplets, but there were complications in the pregnancy which caused the 3rd girl to end up as a miscarriage. He immediately added that of course they were very happy with the miracle of having 2 daughters. The thing took a shape of a fetus at this moment. It's just that our mother, in particular, felt that she had failed, that she had lost one of her daughters. It was apparently a whole grieving process where only our remaining lives had been a consolation for her. At that time, we did not know how to react. We kind of felt that we had done something wrong, even though it wasn't really so. The tension lingered in the house for several days before it started to subside, and we never again mentioned our third twin to our parents. Between the two of us, on the other hand, we finally had a possible explanation for the thing. It must be our third sister. Why she looked like this was still a big question, though. Maybe that's just what souls look like. Or maybe a soul normally takes the shape of the body it dwells in, and our sister looks like this because her body never developed. One thing was certain. We needed to explore this further and find answers. As we grew older, this research took up more and more of our lives. We each chose relevant fields of study to gain more information. We were dealing with a soul, so I chose to combine certain courses to shape my own specialization, a form of religious anthropology where I try to chart the evolutions of beliefs among different populations throughout history. That way, we might be able to find similar situations or put forward different hypotheses. My sister, on the other hand, struck out in a completely different direction, specializing in general linguistics or lexicology. How does a language form? How do you learn another language without a dictionary? Are there fundamentals in language that are always the same? Her point was that our sister does have knowledge separate from our earthly life, so she must have had an earlier life that she had difficulty expressing now. It is up to her to communicate with a completely alien thing, or to unravel ancient languages in the hope that there might be some recognition in our third sister. Had our lives remained like this, passionately accumulating more knowledge, there would have not been a problem. But, entirely coincidentally, and independently of our studies, we learned that we could feed our sister, not with material food, but with other souls. It was something I never really paid attention to from childhood, and apparently neither did my sister, though she wouldn't have been able to notice the soft tone it seems to make because of our third sister's constant, rhythmic thumping. It was very stupid. I noted for no apparent reason that flies don't always smell when they smoke. Only when you hit them with the electric fly swatter do they start smelling. My sister chimed in that flies don't smoke at all if you don't kill them with electricity. I was about to ask how she could possibly explain the dead fly that I had just killed with a rag, but I swallowed my words when I realized that to her it didn't smoke indeed. I finally understood that I could also see other souls, that those just smoke up and dissipate soon after death. For the first time, our third sister also showed an interest in this, and she formed a kind of long tongue on which some sort of little volcanoes began to raise themselves up, to then suck up the fly's smoky soul. It must have pleased her, because my sister jumped in and said she was making a very happy sound indeed, like a man who finally got a drop of water after weeks in the desert. I am not proud of it, but of course after that we brought more and more dying animals for her to eat their soul. I initially protested against this, but my sister made the compelling argument that we ate meat just as well. When I tried to use my philosophy course and said that it was ethically different because she did not need the nourishment, my sister closed the discussion by arguing that we cannot know that for all we know, she has been starving all our lives, and I had to admit that her shape looked more vibrant. I even think her corpulence was slowly increasing. However, I maintained that we were not going to kill random animals we find. Instead, we would go to a pet shop that sold living food for snakes, for example. Mice seemed to be our third sister's favorite, but I didn't feel like slaughtering a mouse every day, so she usually got beetles and grasshoppers. It went on like this for a long time, until we both started our PhD. My sister seemed to slowly become more and more fanatical, and I finally got a breakthrough. The professor who promoted me suggested that perhaps I could write my PhD on the cultural impact of the Necronomicon on different cultures throughout history. It was an old text. It had been written by the insane Arab called Abdul al-Hazred. However, it wasn't clear whether he was the original author of the entire book, or whether he had copied parts from even older manuscripts, now lost to history. The entire book was written in ancient Arabic, although there were also incomplete Latin translations. These were both languages that my sister was surprisingly able to help me with, so we decided to turn this into a combined PhD, where I mainly explored what the origins of this strange mythological text might be, and how it had impacted contemporary culture after its publication. And my sister tried to scrutinize and understand the unknown languages described in it, because indeed, not everything was Arabic. Certain incantations were written in different, stranger languages, of which we neither knew the origins, nor recognized any connection to any human language. These were represented by abnormal symbols, which the Arabic text attempted to describe phonetically, although the words felt unnatural to human speech. Of course, it was exactly one of these unknown languages that our third sister responded to. When my sister read a phonetic segment, Cthulhu vertagen? The thing seemed to take a bow. It might have been better had I not said anything at that point. Then everything might have worked out. Actually, it might have been better if we had never even started the PhD. So we had learned that our third sister was responding to one of the spells of a particular language in the ancient book. A language that was apparently attributed to an obviously fictional race of what, according to the book, are shapeless, half-material eldritch monsters who can fly with wings independent of gravity. Lest I be too pedantic and claim that our third sister is not shapeless, quite the contrary, she has lots of continuously changing shapes. I must admit that the book's descriptions do describe her exactly. After all this time, we had finally found a real clue. So the thing I always saw was not the prenatal form of a soul before it was able to conform to the new body it would inhabit. It was the form of our third sister in her previous life. whereas my sister was now moving forward with even more zeal. I was becoming more and more reserved. I began to understand the horror of the situation better, and to feel that I was losing control by my own hand. Every time when I wanted to object, however, my sister reassured me, and she always had the best arguments. "We may have forgotten our past lives," she said, "but our sister has not. If you feel like you have no control, please think of how our third sister must feel, bound to our every action, unable to go in any direction by herself, unable to live for herself." She did reassure me that way, but when I saw the ball of pissing flesh she spoke so sweetly of, I still had my doubts. In the end, my sister's influence proved too strong. We just continued on, and we even tried out some of the rituals of those eldritch monsters. It made my vegetarian heart bleed, but we had bought a goat to ritually slaughter it on Halloween night in the wooded hills of Eldam. It would be nothing more than a feast for our third sister, I thought. But strangely enough, the ritual actually seemed to work. From deep down below the hills came a shiver, then a tremor. The air went wild, and then for the first time ever, I had an idea of what it was my sister always hears. I don't know if it came from the top of the sky or from under the hills, but a voice spoke with incomprehensible tones directly into my mind.
Mele kerga remja alum asita vertagen.
Somehow, my sister could actually understand it, and though she was limited to a human voice, she even answered back in their language. Our third sister assisted her by genteelly waving Venus tentacles and presumably talking herself. Thus ensued a conversation that seemed to go on for hours, and which I could not make any sense of. Only when the goat was bled out and burned did the shivering of the hills stop, and with it the conversation. My sister looked at me smiling and said that we had our work cut out for us. There was no way I could deny the supernatural event that had just taken place. So even though it made me nauseous, I followed her further in her ventures. She had explained our situation to the things in the sky and underground, and they in turn had explained all sorts of things to her. They were apparently trapped in an extremely painful situation. Escape is something many of them are working on. Our third sister must have been one such soul who was able to escape by chance because of a series of circumstances that happened to be just right. We would now try to reproduce those circumstances as best we can to free more of them. We started with a series of experiments on goats. Those often have twins or even triplets, and so they would make for the perfect test subjects. After all, the sacrifice, that was also a goat, had appealed to the eldritch things. I sincerely wanted to object that this was not ethical, but no objection could outweigh the centuries of suffering of an entire people, whether they be human or not. We started a friendship with a neighboring goat farmer and explained that this was related to our PhD studies. Although it had the semblance of scientific hypothesis, I found that the explanations my sister kept giving were much more like indoctrination than anything else. We did a whole bunch of experiments, sometimes involving our third sister and appealing to the ancient rituals from the Necronomicon. Little really seemed to work. It was quite exceptional for me to see a piece of a second or third soul, depending on whether they were originally meant to be twins or triplets, whose last goat we killed before it could be born. However, none of these souls, that I only saw exceptionally, resembled our third sister, and none of those experiments could be reproduced. Eventually, after years of experimentation, to the point of losing our PhD, we did have a breakthrough. A certain kind of fertility spell seemed to be necessary, but more importantly, we needed to make use of a summoning spell where we ourselves try to force open the gate to one of those eldritch monsters, instead of hoping by chance that one of them just happened to be reincarnating. In the end, we managed to bind souls similar to our third sister to the goats. We, of course, wanted this new eldritch goat to be born healthily, but the fetus always died before birth, and the souls remained bound to the other goat or goats. At that point, however, both me and my sister felt that it was unethical to experiment further, for we could hardly slaughter one of the goats to which the soul was attached to see what kind of effect it might have. We continued to experiment with other magic on other goats, but meanwhile, to my horror, my sister's ambitions were growing. According to her, it was time for humans. This is where I really wanted to draw a line, but she indicated that the quality of life of people was far greater than that of animals. When I wanted to object that being chained to someone else with no input of your own is no life at all, she reminded me that they now live in a continuous hell. Anything is better than that. So again, she got her way, and we looked for couples expecting twins or triplets. This should not have been so easy, but unfortunately, the cybersecurity of certain of our healthcare facilities at that time left a lot to be desired. We happened to know a PhD student in computer science. My sister, of course, could easily convince him to help us. It then struck me for the first time that her way of speaking was not entirely natural, or at least not like it was when we were children. As twins, we have pretty much the same voice, and we always grew up in the same region, so the difference was not easily explained. At the time, I still assumed that this must be an artifact of her language studies. But now, I started to realize that she talked to the goat farmer in a similar way, and actually, whenever I put forward a concern, she would also address me in this particular way of speech. From now on, we would always get a notification whenever a pregnancy gets flagged in some hospital system as potential twins or triplets. We would subtly visit that couple and say that we had spells to ensure a good pregnancy. Of course, people were rightly very skeptical about this, but my sister was able to convince them time and again. Apparently 2 lovely blonde girls saying it won't cost them a dime are not questioned very much. The father is asked to leave, an excuse for him to go to the pub, and the mother is sedated in the process. Then we simply do our ritual, and off we go. As with the goats, the body to which the soul was bound died some time later. It was as if mammals were not suitable hosts for such a soul, and could only house them indirectly. I always had a very hard time with this, but my sister again reassured me that life is meant for the soul. We are early enough in the process that no other soul has nestled in yet. So we are not actually harming anyone, as the eldritch soul can now live a better life. So it continued, until at last, one of our first successful experiments among the goats was considered old enough to breed by the farmer. The result was disturbing. The farmer complimented our experiments and said that his new buck was extremely intelligent. I, on the other hand, only noticed that third, fourth, and fifth eyes it had, 2 of which were on the left cheek respectively, and the last was in the middle of its back looking up. Whenever I said anything about this, he looked at me strangely, as if he didn't see it. And my sister and I both knew we had made another breakthrough. With a mischievous look, my sister immediately started asking questions, taking notes, and making hypotheses. After a lot more experiments, it turned out that further inbreeding could increase the what I call corruption, with more abnormalities that were invisible to anyone but myself, with perhaps the exception of their strangely intelligent and erratic behavior. My sister, of course, preferred a different name for this, and spoke of it as the miracle. Later generations of inbreeding were more miraculous, according to her. When we performed a ritual for the summoning of one of the eldritch monsters before birth, the fetus no longer necessarily died. Instead, it was born with a half-melded soul that only seemed to have limited control over the body, although this control clearly improved with higher concentrations of corruption or miracle. Then my sister asked me a question I had long since dreaded. It was time for us to have children too. None of the other successfully born human twins and triplets we have made are anywhere near old enough for this. How long should we make the eldritch race wait for a better life? These were her arguments. But now I really did not want to hear it. This was more than a bridge too far for me. She could do it herself if she wanted to. Something she would actually go on to do a single time, despite her asexuality. She most certainly wasn't happy with my choice, but she seemed to respect it. Or at least, that was what I thought, until a few nights later I was woken up, handcuffed to my bed, whilst she was performing a fertility ritual. It was indeed the day of my ovulation, and she apologized, but said that it was the most ethical course of action when the destiny of an entire race was on the line. That night, a man entered my room. I tried to shout for him to leave, but I had a noose in my mouth. I tried to kick him away, but with my tied hands and lesser strength, the effect was limited. Apparently, my sister had hit on him in some seedy bar. She had convinced him that she loved roleplay and had a fantasy of being raped. Not for real, of course, but make-believe. She gave him a key and told him where he could find her later. When that man then saw a girl tied up on the bed, looking just like the girl who flirted with him not hours ago, he asked no questions. And that is how my first pregnancy began. She kept apologizing over and over again with this weird way of speaking. She was intermittently humming a strange, rhythmic, droning tone, and I could no longer concentrate enough to stay angry at her. Especially not since she was starting to grow a belly herself. She dared assure me that her experience had been harder than mine, since she is asexual. I still can't believe she could brainwash me so much that I actually believed her and forgave her. I had some freedom then, but that was taken away when the children were born. These also had the strange abnormalities, like gills under the chin, teeth where the eyebrow should be, or the fingertips of an extra hand under the armpits, as if a third arm wanted to grow there. After a lifetime of seeing our third sister, these alterations did not scare me much, but nevertheless, I knew I would never like those things. I wanted to get away, but my sister was onto me and locked me in a barn. The goat farmer stopped asking questions a long time ago. He was completely brainwashed. When I recovered from the pregnancy, I was immediately raped again. From then on, of course I refused to lend any help, which put my sister in a bind, because she needed my eyes to see how successful her experiments were, and how the supernatural side would continue to develop in our children. Her strange, hypnotic speech was also less effective now, so she did the only logical thing she could do. She cut out my right eye with a warm smile and transplanted it to her own emptied socket. How she had done this all without the medical help of a doctor, I will never know. But at the least, she had anesthetized me, an anesthetic that I woke up from when I heard her screams as she started the operation on herself. Last Halloween, the eldritch things under the hills must have taught her a way of transplantation that relied on magic rather than science. The only time I heard a scream worse than that came a few weeks later, when she was finally able to remove the bandage from her eye for the first time to hopefully see through it. Visually, she never had my resistance, and the first sight of our third sister became too much for her. She cried out and fainted whilst foaming from the mouth. This repeated itself several more times, until she started to get used to it, just a little bit. The transplantation was clearly a success, but she would never again be able to look at the goats and our children in the same effective manner. That didn't stop her, however, from continuing on. This is when I began to realize that any normal person would have long since given up. I can handle the sight only because I literally saw it continuously since birth in an unconscious state day after day, until it was the most normal thing in the world for me. With her fully developed consciousness, my sister would never have been able to take that step, any more than I could handle the deep, penetrating sounds of the eldritch things under the hill and in the sky. The only conclusion I could make was that she was no longer my sister, but rather a puppet from our third sister, who must have started her hypnotic droning from the moment we were aware of her existence. That is how the years passed. Time after time I was raped, so that I might give birth to a child I didn't want. My sister, on the other hand, never gave birth again after her first child. Not for her, she dared claim. But I suspect this clash with her natural urge weakened the hypnosis of the thing. She kept visiting me to talk to me and tell me about the progress of her entire operation, where she could now trace twins and triplets from all over Europe. Our bond of trust from childhood was gone, but I played along, in the hope of gaining more trust if I showed myself to be useful and willing. And I also kept quiet about my suspicions of our third sister's control, so that she would be unaware of any wrongdoing. I think it worked out well too, but I can't be entirely sure, because her hypnotic techniques upon myself are getting better and better. Sometimes I struggle to convince myself that what she is doing is actually wrong. I sometimes find it normal that she used her evil magic to keep my sister beautiful and young in appearance, as to better exert her influence on the civilized world, while with me, she only keeps the womb intact. The only organ, apart from maybe the heart, that she did left shrivel up in her body. I was finally able to escape from her hypnosis once more, when my sister indicated that our first children, and some of the twins and triplets we had experimented on, were old enough to start having children of their own without suspicion. She had naturally followed up on these other children over the years as they started communicating with the eldritch souls themselves. When this contact went well, my sister approached them and began her indoctrination. I managed to escape into the night with the only vehicle parked here, trying desperately to remember how to drive a car. After so many years, it was no longer obvious. I didn't know where I would drive, but somehow I followed the way to our parents' house. To them, I must have disappeared off the face of the earth. This is something my sister and I strangely had never talked about over the years. She presumably resolved this with her hypnosis too, or she simply pretended to be me when visiting. When I arrived there, I could see from the letterbox that other people now lived here. There was no car parked in the driveway, so I risked entering in the hope that no one was home. I went to the back of the house and picked up a loose brick from the wall that had been there since I was a child. Behind it, I had once hidden a key that now apparently didn't fit the lock, so I just smashed the window with a brick and crawled in over the broken glass. No one approached me. I must have been right that no one was home. I booted up a computer I had found in a home office upstairs that had once been my bedroom, and I started recording this story in an email window. I hoped I had enough time, because that thing would have long since shouted my sister awake after it realized that a nighttime joyride is not one of my usual behaviors. I don't know if the thing understands what a computer is, but at least it wouldn't be able to explain the details to my sister. Their communication is not that good. And once I get this message out into the world, it will be too late for them. My sister would gather our children to look for me. Certain of their abnormalities mean they can follow my scent better, or run faster on arms and legs than I can get away. One of them even knows where between the shoulder and neck to stick its abnormal nails to temporarily stop the blood flow to my brain as to make me faint. So once they find me, I won't be able to escape. They would have to run down the street I drove down first, though. That thing would then be able to pinpoint perfectly in its field of vision the way I took based on what it saw out of my eye. But it would take time. I just don't know how much. Please, come and free me. Come and help me. If that fails, at least try to stop my sister. Or rather, that thing that tries to replace good human souls with those of incredible monsters. I have long ago, in my studies of the Necronomicon, seen one complex symbol that, according to my later experiments, scares the creatures we made. This is possibly the key that... Oh no, they are here!